The most common question I get is, how did we get into this financial mess? Today we're going to go over the budget a little bit, just do a primer, and everything in the budget starts with spending. This shows you spending since 1999 in the state. Total spending, primarily we're talking GRF here. You can see in 1999 we spent about $21.5 billion. That has shot up to $35 billion currently. The important point is, if you think about the economy, you think about the challenges we faced, spending has gone up almost $10 billion since 2003. But it's not just spending. We've also had some challenges, or we've also turned to short-term borrowing as a way to help balance the budget and to address our cash flows. Now, the important thing to remember, again, this is short-term borrowing under Thompson, Edgar, and Ryan, about $5.5 billion over those 20 years. What is short-term borrowing? It's when we go, we sell bonds, and we have to pay back. We take out a loan, we have to pay it back at the end of the year. We do that if we owe vendors a tremendous amount of money and we don't want to make them wait too long. The problem is it always has to be paid back at the end of the year. This is short-term borrowing under Blagojevich and Quinn. It's almost $12.5 billion under the last 8 years. If you have to go to the bank and get a loan to this tune, you know you've got a problem. Your expenditures and your revenues aren't working out. But it's not just short-term borrowing. We've also turned to long-term debt. 2002, George Ryan's last year in office, the long-term debt in the state of Illinois that we had accumulated, not what we'd ever incurred, but what we'd accumulated up to that point in the history of the state, $7.6 billion. In the last 8 years, we've added almost $20 billion. We're sitting at $26.7 billion in long-term debt. Why is this important? This is important because this has to be paid back. And when you get into the outlying years, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we're going to be paying bond payments over $1 billion. That's $1 billion that won't go to education. It's $1 billion that won't go to law enforcement, to caring for senior citizens or the disabled. So when you hear people say, we need to borrow, we need to borrow, we need to borrow, you need to understand that we've borrowed $20 billion and you've seen the challenges that we have right now. With all the borrowing, spending's gone up, short-term borrowing's gone up, long-term borrowing's gone up. You would think at least we could pay our bills on time. 10 years ago, we didn't have any unpaid bills. Last year, we ended up 2011 with $6.5 billion in unpaid bills. $6.5 billion. We have people, vendors that have waited for months. We've got vendors that we owe millions of dollars, and it's very difficult for them to continue operation. What are some of the cost drivers? Obviously, the pensions. It's important to note that in 2002, the unfunded pension liability was around $35 billion. Today, that's up to 80. And if you include some of the medical costs, people will tell you that's more like $120 billion. How did we get here? In fairness to everybody, you go back to the Thompson administration, the General Assembly and the chief executive at that time did not fully fund the pensions. And when they got away with it once, they decided, well, we can do it again. We can do it again. And nobody lost an election. There was no public outcry. When I came into the General Assembly 9 years ago, I would constantly ask the public sector unions, why aren't you worried about your pensions? And it just wasn't an issue. Everybody assumed it would be there. Well, we are at a crisis point. We have the worst funded pension system in the nation, and this pattern of skipping payments got to an epidemic point during the Blagojevich administration and through the Quinn administration. We have got to insist that whatever reforms we do, that we fully fund the pensions at the actuarial amount. It's that simple. One of the biggest cost drivers we have is Medicaid. You can see that in 2003 there were 1.6 million Illinoisans on Medicaid. Today we're sitting at about 2.8 million. So we have grown the enrollment in Medicaid, which means the largest insurer in the state of Illinois is the state of Illinois. Medicaid has grown over 1 million residents. What does that mean financially? It means that the costs have gone from about $6 billion to almost $11 billion. This is not sustainable, and it is going to be probably one of the most difficult issues that we have to contend with. we've talked about spending, we've talked about short-term borrowing, long-term borrowing, we've talked about unpaid bills, we've talked about unfunded pension liability, and some of the factors that have helped grow our expenditures or obligations, primarily Medicaid. One of the patterns we got into under the Blagojevich administration was an affinity to try for one-time revenues. We never thought long-term. It was always, how do we get out of this budget to the next budget? Let's just get out of Dodge. Well, in the FY10 budget, we had bond refinancing of $500 million. We did fund sweeps of $360 million. Obama administration gave us $1.5 billion in federal stimulus money, and then we borrowed $3.5 billion for the pensions, for a total of almost $6 billion. The problem is these are one-time revenues. You're not going to get $1.5 billion next year from the federal government. You can't go and borrow $3.5 billion again for the pensions. You may borrow that to pay it, but it's still an obligation. The balance sheet is still the same. The pensions are still $3.5 billion short. What we did with this money is then we use that to prop up other places, other spending measures in the General Assembly. Last year when they passed a tax increase, and we could argue night and day whether it should or should not have occurred, one of the concerns I had was prior to a tax increase, you have to address the spending. You have to address how easy it is for us to spend your money. If we don't put a speed bump there, if we don't make it more difficult for General Assembly to spend your money, you will know from looking at these charts, we will spend it. So to give this body $7 billion, I had great reservations. One of the things that they put in here at the end was a spending cap. But it's important to note, we're talking about going from $34 billion in spending. The spending cap allows a 10% increase in the first year. So you're talking roughly a $3 billion spending increase, and then 2% thereafter. So when you go at the end of when this income tax increase is supposed to run its course, and then we revert back to the old tax level, we will have a 16% increase in spending. Folks, only in Springfield can you call that a spending cap. To me, the key to all of this, first of all, everything is fiscal. I would be ecstatic if we did nothing but balance the budget, pass no legislation, certainly no legislation that will make it harder to create jobs. So one is we've got to get spending under control, and it's going to be tough. It is really going to be a challenge, but then also we've got to worry about the job environment. If you look at states our size, we are the worst performing state in job creation. I know this last year's been good, but people need to understand, when you are so far down, you will eventually, if you have any growth at all, you're going to look like you're setting the world on fire. We are well below the 10% job growth rate of Texas since '03. We're down here with California. This isn't going to help anybody to have an economy and a climate like this. The challenge a lot of people had and concern a lot of people had about the income tax increase. Prior to the income tax increase, Illinois was 40th with that 3% rate. When we bumped it to 5%, we became the 13th highest taxing personal income tax state in the nation. Some of this seems rather cloudy. It seems rather gloomy. But my point is this, is when you get to this situation, the opportunity that we have is to fundamentally reinvent what the role of government is. We have things are so tough now that we have the opportunity to make some decisions that we otherwise never would have been able to make. But now we can do it. I believe that we can turn the corner. I believe working together, bipartisanly, or if we have to as a Republican bloc, we can implement some of these changes like pay-as-you-go. You've seen the Speaker and Republican leader Cross talk about some reforms that were unheard of 9 years ago. So I think change is coming. It's not going to be easy. For a decade, for probably 5 decades, politicians have run on promising things, what they can do. I think from this point forward, there has to be a paradigm shift. Politicians have to run on how they're going to manage your money. How are they going to be a fiscal steward of your tax dollars, and what kind of future are we going to leave your children and grandchildren? Thank you.